Hi, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Casting Calls. Today's guest is the fabulous Matthew Sefick, who has cast such projects as Homeland, Army Wives, Mr. Mercedes, The Passage, Paradise Lost. He's currently casting a show called Queen of the South. Say hi to Matt Sefick. Matt, welcome.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. Good. Thank you for being with us today. And you go by Matthew. That's like your professional name, but I've always called you Matt. So does anybody call you Matthew?
It's funny you ask. So yes, just any place my name appears in writing, it always reads Matthew.
Oh.
And yeah, that's because, but everybody calls me Matt because when I was young, I moved out to Omaha and everybody shortens your name out in the Midwest. But my mom hates it.
Oh, really? She's like, I named him Matthew.
Yes. So I have to take care to make sure, and double check credits and all that good stuff. So yeah, there's actually kind of a little bit of a story behind it. But yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. So Matt, can you tell us first, how did you get into casting? What led you here?
Well, I went to school for, my undergrad was in film studies, which is like an English degree for film students. And my master's was in video production. And I thought that I wanted to be a production manager. And so that's what I was studying and preparing for. And then I got out in the field and realized that's not what I wanted to do. And the first show I worked on was a show called Walker Payne. Probably nobody's seen it. It was on Stars. But I worked as the assistant to the director. The director is a guy named Matt Williams. He best known for, he was a writer on The Cosby Show and he was on some episodes, but he created Roseanne and Home Improvement. And so, yeah, and he came out of the acting world, was also obviously a writer. And I spent, the better part of 3 months, and my main responsibility was to pick him, the first AD, and the cinematographer up bright and early in the morning, get them to set, and return them home at night. And the rest of the time I spent basically as his personal assistant and did whatever he needed. And I got to watch him work with actors, like 3 months, and realized that I wanted to get into casting. And so it took a little while from that point to actually get into the department because I had to, start in entry-level positions. Mm-hmm. And then finally, I was on Army Wives, actually, and they wanted to make some changes with the casting department. And Barbara D'Alessandro, who's a mentor of mine, thought that I would be a good fit. And it just kind of has continued from there. So kind of fell into it a little bit, which is what a lot of people in this business will tell you about how they ended up, working as a prop master, whatever it is. You kind of get into it and figure out what you like best. I'm unlike a lot of casting directors. I didn't start out as an actor or wanting to be an actor. I never had a desire to be on your side of the camera, always behind it. So just kind of work towards it. And it's something I really enjoy.
Yeah. And actually, I know that you also love directing and have actually gotten to do that in some big, actually, The Inspectors. That was one of the projects that you cast, and you got to, did you direct an episode of The Inspectors?
I did. It, at this stage, I'd rather get into producing and leave, the directing to the directors. But I just produced a short film with grant money that we're now applying to festivals that I think turned out pretty well. So at some point I'll put it online once it's run its festival course.
Yeah, it turned out really well because you shared that with me, and I thought it was really amazing what you guys did on that budget and what you were able to do, and it's a great project. So I hope a lot of people get to see it.
Me too. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. So let me ask you something. What makes you invite an actor to audition with you? You get hundreds of submissions for even a 1 or 2 line co-star role. What's your process? What makes you select that person's, Actors Access profile?
So every role is different, obviously, depending on size and what you're looking for. What I gravitate most to on resumes is television experience, because I know the shows that shoot in the Southeast. You could have a long list of film credits that I may not know one of them on there. So that's typically, and at this point, I know we have actors all the time, new actors coming to the area, but I know most of the actors in some way. And so It's really making sure I'm asking for actors who have the amount of credits that would make me feel comfortable putting them on set with all the other cast and crew.
Now, you've told me before when we've chatted about this that because, and I know this to be true about you, that sometimes you do invite newer actors that don't have credits yet. What
I
is it
do.
that makes them jump out to you? How does that work?
At that point, yeah, I should have included that in my response first pass. But yeah, so then I look at, because, obviously you cast smaller roles where you've got actors that have had less experience, they're being submitted. And so at that point, I pivot to looking at their training. And because I also know most of the people that are training actors in the Southeast. So the television experience and training are the two things that I rely most on when I'm going through. And what I do, my typical process is I go, say breakdown is for female in her 20s, any ethnicity, you're going to see probably 600 headshots and resumes or something like that. So what I'll do, and it's a fairly time consuming process, but I'll go through and I'll make a first pass. And I think you tell your students kind of what our side of everything looks like. And so just to, in order to keep this short, we see the little thumbnails, or you can go in and look at their profile. And so I make a pass where I just am looking at the thumbnails, and I'm picking actors I know that could potentially be right for it. And then I do a pass where I go into their profile and I click through each one and look at their resumes to make sure I'm not missing anybody that I should be seeing.
Oh, that's great info. Yeah, I love that, because I've seen you work somewhat, and you are one of the most detail oriented people. You do a really nice job. You deep dive into people's profiles. I've seen you, handle this stuff. And so I know that you're paying attention to people's resumes, and not only their credits, but their training, which is an important aspect, because a lot of actors have a tendency not to fill out their profiles all the way. And that's one of the things that we're talking about all the time. What good does it do you if you don't have that information up there so people like you can find it?
Well, and I try to be thorough, because I'm asking a lot of the actors that are submitted and then ultimately audition. And so I feel that I have to ask a lot of myself in that situation.
That's awesome. Question for you. How long do you watch an audition before you skip on to the next? You're watching it and you're like, nope, that's not right. How long do you usually give it?
It varies, but a lot of times, sometimes less than 20 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I know that if it's not holding my attention, then it's not going to hold the attention of somebody that when they're watching this, they're not going to be, I'm watching at my computer with, Bose headphones on, and I'm, engaged fully. The people that I'm showing it to are not going to be. They're going to have a zillion other things going on. And so often now, and it's, it's a little bit painful for me, but, they'll be watching audition videos from their phone.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's just something you see more and more of. So it's got to be able to hold the viewer's attention. And if it doesn't hold mine for, that right off the bat, I know that I've lost, I wouldn't be able to present that person, because it would be canceling out of spot for somebody that could potentially book the job. So
I say all the time that to actors, we can never underestimate the power of the opening moment, because if we don't grab them in the opening moment, then they may not ever get to the ending moment.
Well, and yes. And that's something that, you've heard me say time and time again, it's easy for me I usually make a couple of passes before I submit my selects. And it's very easy for me to narrow down to eliminate 75% of the auditions that are submitted, because the actors aren't doing stuff that's on the page that needs to be as part of their performance to hold my attention. So I can very easily eliminate 25%. And then it goes into, making sure I have, I try not to overwhelm, usually 8 to 10 actors. And then I also need to vary depending on ethnicity and age. If it's a wider age range, I might need to give more of a, palette for them to choose from, that kind of thing. So.
But you're saying the majority of the time you submit 8 to 10 actors to production for them to choose?
Yeah. Typically directors don't want to have to sort through more than that, especially if you're doing a lot of if you've got a lot of roles. And then, but that said, on some of the smaller projects I do where the directors might not have as much experience, sometimes they want to see more, or like smaller independent features, or, you know, I do these round of grant projects every year. And sometimes they'll want to see more actors, but typically for a television show that you'd be familiar with, yeah, 8 to 10 options.
Isn't that interesting that sometimes the smaller budget projects, they want to have more control and see more things, and the bigger budget projects, everybody kind of stays in their own lane. And so they trust, hey, Matt's going to handle casting and he'll send the best on to us. But in the smaller budget, they're like, I need to see everything.
Yeah. And in that kind of same vein, you also get to where if you've worked with a group of people long enough, like sometimes those smaller projects or even on new projects, the director might say, oh, are there any more options out there that I could look at? And but once you have their trust, they just make a decision and move on.
That's great. All right, any actor pet peeves, things that actors do? I know one of your pet peeves that I can share if you don't, but just because I've heard it enough times to know, this is a Matt Sefick pet peeve.
Is it audition instructions?
Yes, that's one. But actually, the one I was thinking about are mouth props. That's what I call them.
That one actually hadn't crossed my mind. Yeah, when you sent over a list of potential questions, I had a little bit of trouble thinking of some of these. But the biggest one for me is audition instructions, because it takes time to put those together, and there's always a reason that we've asked for things in a certain way. And so you really, because we're putting so much time getting those together and right, if you're lucky enough to get an audition, you should put in the time to make sure you've got the audition instructions correct. And they're different for everybody too. I know that, there's some things that, some similarities, but I've seen other audition instructions just because, over the years it happens. And, but follow those. I really dislike it when an actor's asked to audition for 2 roles and they upload the same, or they upload both roles to one EcoCast invite, because then I've got to go through and download it and upload it. And I watch it first and to know that if I need to actually do that. And then if I do it if I need to. And then, and then, mouth props. Yeah, it's just so distracting. And it's like, I don't know, I will say, if you ever feel the urge to put a toothpick in your mouth, stop it. I don't care.
Away from the toothpicks. I know, we were talking about chapstick, chewing gum, eating if you didn't need to be, things like that. So yeah, that makes me laugh. What about slates? What do you do with slates? Do you send them on to production, or are they mainly just for you to see what the actor's body type is to make sure that it's suitable for that particular role? Do you keep them separate, or do you actually send them to production?
I actually send them, because a lot of times when you're doing regional casting, where the actor is coming from could potentially matter. And so I ask for name, height, and where the actor resides, so that we know what we're looking at. If you're looking, just typically those are the most helpful things for me. A slate, I'm not really critiquing any slate as far as how they present themselves or anything like that. It's strictly informational. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, I appreciate so much the fact that you are so great about seeing actors from not just Atlanta, but from all these pockets of the Southeast that happen to have good actors. I mean, you've cast so many of my students here in Orlando, and I've gotten to work on projects with you because you really genuinely look at the whole market, not just that one little pocket in Atlanta.
Yeah, and I think some of that probably started because of just the nature of where I was doing this to begin with. In Charleston, we just don't have a very large pool of actors. So you had to be familiar with not only actors in, Orlando, but Atlanta and, really Charlotte and Wilmington, all over. And that's why I call it regional. I prefer the title regional casting as compared to local casting, because you're really having to cast a bigger pool. than, I mean, you can shoot a project in Atlanta and probably do pretty much all locals if you wanted to. But
Sure.
when I was doing The Passage in Atlanta, I still looked at actors from, I'm pretty sure we even hired a couple from Orlando.
You did, yeah.
Yeah.
Both Victoria White and Henry Gibson, I think, were in the same episode, actually.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's a really fun story. Yeah, it's really nice when things like that work out.
Yes, I love that. So any favorite casting stories that you could share with us? Anything that sticks out to you as a memorable moment in these years of casting?
Well, most I can't share in exactly public setting, but considering what we've got going on, I was out jogging and thinking about this, because like, what can I use as a good story? And I kept coming back to it's been a couple of years ago now, but I had a meeting with a director for a potential project, and so like actors go through preparation, I do the same thing on my end when I'm going to have to be in that position where I'm being judged based on my resume and my performance, I guess you will. And so I was on the drive there and thinking about how the conversation's going to go. And so I had done everything prior. So I thought about, looked at the director's experience, familiar with the project, familiar with the roles, making sure I'd done all my prep. And then once I do all that, then I'm kind of like, all right, now screw it. Now I need to do the best job of being present that I can be, the best job I can do of being present in the moment and kind of giving what they take me, or taking what they give me, in the sense that, you don't, in a situation like that, you don't want to come, it may be like the last, like Paradise Lost. So that interview I was fairly nervous about because I really liked the material. Mm-hmm. So like I really wanted to work on the show, and but you don't want to go in there and be completely way too eager or anything like that. So but anyway, I'd gone down for a different project, and the filmmaker was not from this country, the director, and he said, we had a very nice conversation, and I knew it was going well. And then at one point, one of the producers got up and went to the bathroom, and so we kind of had, we were done talking business. And so on the way down, I thought, an interesting question that I would like to know. So he's been successful at making films in this other country, and now he was supposed to make his first American film, and so I'm curious as so what's different about storytelling in America as opposed to where he was from. Mm-hmm. And he said, and as I was asking the question, I could tell that he had clearly thought about this prior. But he said how did he phrase it? He said, you guys don't have any kind of safety net, so I can immediately make the stakes higher. And that's always kind of stuck with me, since, and it seems kind of appropriate to the situation we find ourselves in now. And I don't know, that I've always thought that was interesting. When we ended up, the movie never got made, and I never got the job. So,
well, at least you didn't get the job because it didn't get made. Versus
exactly. But then the others, are pretty anecdotal and involve stuff that you usually have to keep fairly private. So anything in particular you have a question about, or that might lead me to something interesting?
No, you got to work with some pretty big names, like on Mr. Mercedes. Did you ever have conversations with Stephen King? Were you involved in anything that involved, because he was wasn't he a head EP on that show? He
was, but once he trusted Jack Bender a whole lot, and so he came to visit once to do a little cameo, and they kept it hush hush. And I actually hadn't gone to set that day. I spent a lot of time on set for that show just because of the nature of how it worked. But so I didn't get to meet him, but he didn't have a lot of involvement. But David E. Kelley was on the show, yeah. And Jack Bender was talking through a point with Mary Louise Parker and Brendan Gleeson that just story-wise they were all having an issue with. And so I'm sitting out and to call it an office is a stretch. It was basically I was in a conference room that they put up cubicle walls for me. But I was right by, all of the producers and directors. And so I could obviously hear them talking. And so they're talking through this story point and they can't come to any kind of conclusion. And Jack Bender says, well, let's get David Kelly on the phone. And so they do. It takes them a minute to connect with him. And then they start talking through the issue, and I can hear him. I can't hear what he's saying, unfortunately, but he talks for about 2 minutes, and everybody's, oh yeah, okay, yeah. They hang up, and it was like he had resolved whatever story. I can't remember this particular point, but yeah, it was like, yes, okay, so that's why you're who you are and do what you do.
Yeah.
That's really. Yeah, that was pretty interesting. And Brendan Gleeson, just overall, he was a really nice guy, and he treated the crew incredibly well. And so it's always fun. And the show I'm on now, what's her name? The woman from Sex and the City, not the lead, but essentially the number 2.
Is she on Sex and the City? I'm on. So not.
Sarah,
Samantha?
Kim Cattrall.
Kim Cattrall. I was like, she plays Samantha. Okay, good.
Yeah. So the travel coordinator for Queen of the South, I was talking to her. We were just, as we were gearing up before the shutdown, she said she had just finished a show for Fox, and we started talking about that. And I said, oh, that's great. I hadn't heard of it. But she said, oh, yeah, the lead is Kim Cattrall. I was like, oh, how was she? Because
there's stories out there about her. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, exactly. And I expected that, she might not be the nicest person. And the travel coordinator said, no, she's fantastic. I had a birthday brunch a couple of months ago with my friends, and I just kind of on a whim invited her and never expecting her to come. And she showed up and hung out and brunch with us and drinks. And I was like, oh, that's good to hear. And then I was like, because she was literally like my first crush from Mannequin. So
always in America. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I never wanted to hear, I didn't like hearing the, negative things about her. So that was a fun little tidbit to hear recently, but it's always interesting to hear how people, treat the other cast members and crew and things like that.
For sure. And especially when we're working with people that we've respected for a long time or admired for some reason. I've only had one incident over the years of someone that I really respected and admired being a jerk. Most of the time they're like gracious and wonderful, and you're like, oh, they're this person. When I got to meet Sissy Spacek, I just love her so much, and she was just as wonderful. It would have broken my heart if she'd been a jerk. So
yeah, well, that's great, because she's a good one to, that's definitely good to hear, and what a fun experience that must have been.
Yeah, that one was. Now let me ask you your last question. If you were in a parallel universe and you weren't a casting director, what would you be? What would your job be?
Well, I'd like to get into producing, but you mean totally out of the business?
Yeah, something completely different from the business.
You know what? I like routine, and so I could so see being a postal worker. Enjoying that, because I like driving and I like a routine, and I'm pretty sure they run the same routes pretty much all the time. So like I could listen to NPR for 10 hours a day and drive around and deliver mail and enjoy myself.
Matt, that is one of my favorite answers ever, and just goes to show you're one of my favorite people ever. Because I'm picturing you in the cute little shorts and the postal worker outfit. And you learned so much about postal workers from working on The Inspectors, didn't you?
Yeah, and I wouldn't like it on rainy days, but other than that, it seems like a pretty good gig.
I think you're right. And they have a really good retirement plan from what I hear. Good pensions and stuff like that. One of the last few true government jobs.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Matt.
Of course. Thank you. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
You too.